So welcome everyone. You can't see me, but you should be able to hear me. I'm Kathleen and I'm the president of Cloudscape. Thank you for joining us today for this workshop. I think we're gonna have a great time. I'm just gonna be introducing the event and then I'll pass it over to Jonathan in a second. Before we get started today, we do here at Cloudscape, we want to acknowledge that we are, even though this event is virtual, we are joining you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we just want to be, conscious of how grateful we are to be able to be bringing you this event from these lands, even though we were not invited to be here. If you are joining us from somewhere else and you would like to share what territories or ancestral lands you might be joining us from, feel free to put that in the chat. We'd love to hear about that. I'm gonna disappear in a second, but I'll also just introduce you to another one of our team members. You've already seen them pop up in the chat. Scarlet Wings Kylie is our tech support today, handling all of the Twitch related tech things, and she'll probably be helping us out with some questions later on in the workshop. So I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan in a sec. Jonathon has been a part of Cloudscape for a really long time. He was around for the beginning, and I think not to say that you're super old, John, but eons.
I am now. It's true.
Eons of time have passed, and this is why we're so lucky to be here, learning from you today, because you're just a fantastic cartoonist, and I'm really excited to learn your point of view on writing and drawing characters for long form comics. So I think that's enough of me talking. I'm just going to hand it over to you and teach us all you got, man.
Okay, thank you. That's a wonderful introduction. Okay, I'm Jonathan, and we're here to talk about writing and drawing characters for long form comics. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is applicable to not just long form comics, but to any comic. But there are some specific things that will apply more to comics that are of the longer end of the spectrum. Not really kind of any definition between a short comic and a long comic, but when you're writing for long comics, there's more planning you need to do, especially when it comes to characters. So I wrote myself a little CV here. So I did some math. And I think I've actually drawn about 1,000 pages of comics at this point, between a couple of graphic novels, another graphic novel on the way, and a bunch of short stories and whatever else I've done since I first had a website. My first graphic novel was Lords of Death and Life. It came out in, I believe, 2012. It was a long time ago. And it won a Xeric Award when that was still a thing. If you don't know what a Xeric Award is, they don't exist anymore. But it was about 60 pages. It's kind of like a historical fiction with some magical elements set in ancient Mexico. And I followed that up with A Mad Tea Party, which is about 300 pages. And it's a science fiction story. It's about two genetically engineered sisters that have to escape a revolution. And then the book I'm working on right now is going to be published by Cloudscape sometime in the next year. It's called Phobos and Deimos. And it's also science fiction. It's about a refugee from Mars who moves to Earth and has to survive high school. And so between those books and all the other comics I've done, I've created a lot of characters. I've had to figure out how to fit them into plots and make it all make sense. I've had to figure out how they look, how they interact with each other. And I would love to share what I've learned along the way. This is sort of my opinion, I guess, but I am of the opinion that comics is a character-centric medium, that more so than other media, other forms of storytelling, characters really matter in comics. And sort of my evidence for that is if you think about the comics that you know, the comics that you love, chances are pretty good that the characters in that story are going to be high on the list of the things that you care about, or the things that make you feel connected to that story. So I've got just a few random examples here, but I think more people know who the characters are in Watchmen than know who wrote or drew the story. Certainly that's true with any comic, whether it's a superhero comic or Archie comics or a legacy newspaper comic, any comic that has had multiple creators, multiple artists over the years. You know the character, like more people know and care about Spider-Man than they know who's currently drawing Spider-Man, because it's the character that really sticks in your head. That's the thing that kind of draws the reader in and holds them. And I have a couple of theories about maybe why that is, although I don't know any of this for sure. But one possibility is that this might be because of the masking effect. This is something that Scott McCloud described in Understanding Comics. The masking effect is the idea that when you're reading a story, you kind of put yourself into the place of the main character and see the story through their eyes. So this is more effective if the character is drawn in a more cartoony way. They feel like kind of an empty shell you can put yourself into. But I feel like the masking effect is stronger in comics than it is in other media. So for example, in film, at least in live action film, you have an actor playing a part, and it's, I think, a little harder to keep from seeing that actor as like a person external to yourself. Obviously, the point of storytelling is for you to feel a connection to this character, to feel like you're experiencing what they're experiencing. But I don't know, I feel like the barrier is lower in comics where it's a drawing of a person. And on the other hand, if you look at prose fiction, like any story that's written out in words, you do also put yourself in the place of that character, but you don't really have a sense of what they look like. Even if there's descriptions of the character, even if they're really strong descriptions and you have a kind of a sense of what they look like, it's a different experience than seeing a character and then also putting yourself in the place of that character. Or maybe it's not that at all. Maybe it's that because of the way comics are made, the character becomes kind of a symbol. The extreme example of that is Mickey Mouse, where like the Mickey Mouse, you can just draw 3 circles. And if they're the right 3 circles, you instantly recognize that character. So with a drawn character, they become kind of a symbol that stands for that story, and much more so than would be possible in other media. But whatever the reason is that this happens, I think the character is the main thing that that connects people to stories. I should also say that we're going to have a Q&A at the end of this, but if anyone has any burning questions along the way, put it in the chat in the Twitch, and we'll answer as many as we can. So when you're coming up with characters, your characters have to come from somewhere. You have to get your ideas from somewhere. And fortunately with characters, you've got lots of options and you never have to pick just one. So I think most writers have like something of themselves in every character that they write. I know that's true for me, that every character has at least a little bit of me in them. It's almost like you take yourself and you break yourself into lots of little pieces and then make pieces move around and do stuff. So who you are is always going to inspire your characters at least a little bit. Other places you can look for inspiration. I'm always paying attention to people around me, people I know, people I've just met, and that you can get some great ideas for characters from that. You do need to be a little careful with that. You don't want to lose any friendships over creating a character for a comic book. So I think a good strategy there is to, you don't necessarily need to have a character who's an exact copy of someone you know. You can take little bits and pieces from different people and like reassemble them into a new character, and kind of then the character becomes their own thing. They're not, it's not a story about your friend. It's a story about someone who has one thing in common with your friend. So you can also get inspiration from other characters that have existed that other people have created. Again, you might not want to take the whole character or whole cloth because then it might be too obvious what you've done. And you want to create your own characters. You want to have something original. A good example of this, though, is my last slide had Rorschach from Watchmen. If you know sort of the origin story of the Watchmen comic, all of those characters were originally superhero stories that DC Comics bought, and they wanted to put them in their universe, and they hired Alan Moore to write a comic with them all, and he wrote this story, and then DC said, oh wait, no, we don't actually want you to kill off all these characters you just paid all this money for. So he just like changed them. So Rorschach was originally a version of the Question, who's kind of an obscure superhero character with a blank face and a trench coat. And then he becomes this sort of character that's like, you can tell who it's from, you know, it's based on this other character, but it's different enough that, you know, oh no, this is Alan Moore's character. This is his version of this other character. But it's not actually the same character. You can also find examples or sources for inspiration from history, from the world around you. There's so many people in history that would make great stories. Every historical fiction is basically, or historical drama even, is taking a real historical figure and turning them into a character. I feel like a lot of the mad scientist characters that you see in, especially a lot of the early Marvel comics, are based on the way scientists worked in the Gilded Age. So people like Thomas Edison or Nikola Tesla, these sort of like heroic science types who had really good media about them and had lots of money because they had like an industry they were running and they made all these inventions, but then maybe weren't all necessarily always that great people. And that's a great inspiration for a story. You could take that and say, oh, here's my supervillain. I know what my character would be like if they had this same situation as a Thomas Edison type. And you can also come up with characters based on, well, pretty much anything. So like tropes, people tend to be down on tropes, like you shouldn't put tropes in your story, but they can be a good starting point. You can take the idea of a heroic character and then subvert it, or take the idea of like a magical girl and then figure out something new to do with that idea. In one of Scott McCloud's books, he makes the claim that the Fantastic Four are maybe based on the four elements as like a starting point for like, where am I going to come up with four different characters with superpowers? And it's not super obvious that that's what they are, but if you think about it, it does kind of make sense. Like maybe Stan Lee and Jack Kirby just sat down and said, okay, four elements. What can we do with that? Like, let's make a superhero. And so, yeah, I mean, any dumb idea can turn into a great character. Doesn't matter where your inspiration comes from. It matters what you do with it. Here's a character from Phobos and Deimos. And he was maybe one of the more difficult characters for me to write when I was coming up with the characters for this story. And he ended up being a little bit of all of these things. So like all my characters, he is a little bit me, as is everyone else in the story. I did sort of piece together other sources for inspiration where I was trying to figure out like, who is this character? What kind of a person is he? I know I wanted him to be a revolutionary. I know I wanted him to be an artist. So I was looking around for like, what can I use and like put together for this character? So I did he is a little bit like someone I know. And I thought, okay, this character might kind of fit. I'm going to take this person and like take a few traits from him and put him in this character. He is a little bit like revolutionary characters in other stories. The original name that I gave him was based on a historical figure. I ended up changing his last name because as I was writing the story, I realized that, oh, this is not like, I gave him an Iranian last name, but this is not an Iranian last name that would be for a male character. So I changed it. But that was sort of my starting point, is like, here's a historical figure that I'm interested in. I want to name someone after them. And then it went a different way afterwards. I took his face from a character or from a real person. This is something I'll often do, is just like Google random things and then find a face that kind of fits with my idea of what this character is supposed to look like. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that was part of this character creation too. So yeah, all these elements like add up together and create a character that is hopefully unique and different from any character that anyone else has written. Okay, so I'm going to talk, most of this talk is going to be about two separate streams. So there's like the drawing part of creating a character and the writing part. And obviously they're both important because this is comics, you need both. But I'm going to kind of split them in two for now and like talk about them separately. So part of designing your character is figuring out what they look like. And one of the things you want to do if you're going to have a long form stories, you're probably going to have lots of different characters. It's probably not going to be just one person. So you want to have your characters look different from each other. They need to be recognizable right away, that these are different people. They're not all cardboard cutouts. You can draw more than one type of person. And giving them a unique silhouette is a good way to do that. So not just their body type and their size, although that's a good starting point too, but also like what shapes do they make? Like what shapes are their hair or their outfits or their boots? What kind of accessories do they carry around? All these things can like give your character like a distinctive kind of cardboard cutout shape that makes them like instantly recognizable. So the Kate Beaton is a cartoonist who has a show that's coming out that's based on one of her characters or some of her characters. And they've got some great character designs. I haven't seen the show yet, but I love the character designs. And they're a pretty motley group. They're like all very different from each other. We've got some quite a range of character shapes here. But you don't have to have a cartoony style in order to do that. Another good example of this, I think, is Death Note, where especially the Shinigami characters are like, they're very bizarre. They're a little unsettling. They're all quite different from each other. And like you would be able to recognize Ryuk here, the guy with the crazy eyes, like instantly, even if it's like a tiny little silhouette in the back of a scene, like you know that shape. That's Ryuk. It's not going to be anyone else. And then contrast him with other characters in the story who are like totally different and not the same type of character at all. You also want to do that with faces. You don't want to have all your characters look identical. So my go-to example of what not to do is when Jim Lee was drawing the X-Men, especially the women on the team all kind of look the same. Like you can't really tell who they are until the colorist gets his turn to like put color on them, and you can tell, oh, this is the redhead. This must be Jean Grey. I don't think that's a good way to create your characters. I think we can do better. No shade on Naoko Takeuchi, but we kind of get the same with Sailor Moon, where all the characters kind of look pretty similar to each other. And I think there's room for like a little more variety there. You'll make your characters more distinctive, more interesting if they all look different from each other, if they look like different people. So I picked a couple of examples that I think do this really well. Carla Speed McNeil is really good at drawing like realistic-ish type faces, but that they look very different from each other. They have different features, different shapes. And she's so good at this that she can even draw different characters that are clearly related to each other because they have similar features, but they're just slightly different. And then you realize, oh, they're not only are they different people, but they're like related different people. So that's, I think, it's a pretty good skill. Something I would like to have myself is to be able to have that control over the drawing of a character where you can either make them look completely different from each other or like slightly different, and to have that sort of the range that we can see the distinction between those two. Another good example is Jen Wang. This is from her graphic novel Stargazing. And she has a very cartoony style, but you're not going to mistake these two characters for each other. They're clearly different characters. They have different face shapes, different hair, different expressions, different noses. Everything about them is different. And so that's really going to help the storytelling, where you're never going to mix anyone up. Everyone looks different from each other. Okay, so another thing that I think is important with characters is what they actually do in your comic. So you're not just creating your character sheet, your drawing of what the character looks like, and calling it job done. Your characters in a comic are actors. They have to actually go out and do stuff. Every panel, they're doing something different. They have a different expression. They have a different pose. And you can put a lot of distinction on a character with how you draw what they're doing. So the first example here is from a comic of mine that I was drawing, but was written by somebody else. And this main character here, Bold Riley, is like, she's a very strong character. She's very distinctive. And I figured when I'm drawing her, I'm going to make her like take up a lot of space. Like, she's not meek, she's not subtle, she's not sneaky. She's a warrior with a sword who goes around and gets in fights. And so she needs to be someone who like takes up space. She moves around the panel. She's like using her hands, like for talking with her hands. She's gesturing. Her posture is tied to her emotional state. So that's the kind of stuff I was thinking about when I was drawing her, is how do I show that and then make her different from how I would draw a different character. I've got some examples here from other comics as well. This example from Death Note, this is Elle, and Elle has completely different posture, completely different body language. He can't stand up straight. He's always slouching. He sits in chairs weird. He holds objects like by dangling them. He's got very weird body language, but it's very distinctive and very unique to him. So just and especially with Death Note, because it's a comic where characters spend a lot of time talking and not a lot of time doing stuff, his sort of unique body language not only helps to make him distinct and different from everybody else, but it has a lot of interest. Like, if you want to turn the page to see, like, okay, is he gonna put shoes on? Is he gonna like, what kind of weird facial expression is he gonna make now? So it gives him a lot of character. And you can see this with when people cosplay Elle, often one of the things they'll do is like adopt his mannerisms. Like, they'll like walk around kind of hunched over and that kind of thing. And that's part of his character. It's important that Elle is like that. If he didn't act like that, he wouldn't be Elle, he'd be somebody else. And I've got another example here. This is from Yotsuba. Yotsuba is a 5-year-old, and there's a lot of the comedy in this comic is like physical comedy. So the body language is important. She's a 5-year-old who like doesn't really fit into the world, as no 5-year-old ever does, and kind of is figuring it out as she goes. So if she's like falling down the stairs, or like falling down a hill, or like hiding in a cupboard, like she's got very distinctive body language. The acting part of it is a big part of the interest of the story and sort of the mood of the scene. Like, this scene wouldn't work with different body language. Okay, so a couple of other things about creating your characters and the way that they look. You can also think about how your character dresses. Like, what kind of stuff do they wear? Do they always wear the same outfit like Charlie Brown? Which has its advantages, because you're never going to mistake Charlie Brown for someone else if he's got that shirt with the zigzags on it. But for another character in another story, that wouldn't work. If your character is someone who cares a lot about fashion, they're not going to wear the same costume all the time. They're going to have like different outfits for different occasions. Are they goth? Are they like, what's their personality? What does the things that they choose to wear show about their personality? That's a great way to convey things about a character, is just by what they're wearing. and if it changes around all the time. So also the style that you draw your character in, are they cartoony? Are they realistic? Are they somewhere in between? Do you have different styles within the same comic? This is something that happens a lot in manga, where the main characters will be a little more cartoony than the secondary or tertiary characters. And that's kind of the masking effect again, where you can like put yourself as a reader more easily in a character who's drawn in a slightly simpler style. But if you draw the character that way, then you're telling something to the reader. You're saying, this is the character, this is the main character, the one you need to connect to. Rather than like drawing all the lines of all the wrinkles on their face, then it might read differently. You also, especially with long form comics, you want to design characters that you are willing to draw over and over and over again. So if you hate drawing bicycles, don't come up with a character who rides bicycles all day long. And this is a mistake that I always make all the time. Don't give them too many things for their outfit, because if you give them like 20 different belts and pouches and like 3 jackets, then you have to draw that like every page, multiple panels. So make it a little simpler and you'll save yourself some work. Even if it suits the character, find a simpler way of conveying the same sense. Color is also really useful. I recently read the Hawkeye comics that David Aja drew, and he and the colorist kind of did some really interesting things with color, where you've got this supposedly superhero comic, but they spend a lot of their time in not superhero clothes. And so they use color to match up the characters. So a character who has a purple outfit will have purple civilian clothes too. Or someone whose sort of distinctive color is red will have like a red car. You can use color to connect things with those characters and to make them stand out from each other. And take your inspirations from wherever you can get. Like we live in a world full of inspirations. Don't get your inspirations just from other comics. Otherwise, you're going to end up drawing the same outfit that was popular in the 90s for your characters, and it's not the 90s anymore. So I've got some tools here that I find useful for comics, or for creating characters. First, here is a character sheet. I would recommend anyone who's designing characters for a comic to do that, to have some pictures of your character that you've designed before you start drawing it. Partly just to figure out what your character is going to look like before you have to draw them on the page, but also as reference, so that if you know what your character looks like, you can draw them the same every time. There's no single way to set up a character sheet. Everyone will do it a different way. I like to do it with the like a picture of the character and then like a front view and a side view, because you're going to end up drawing your character from different angles. So it's useful to have at least 2 different points of view of what their face looks like. And then these 6 different expressions. This is again from Scott McCloud, who is kind of the go-to expert for how comics work. But in another of his books, he talks about how there's these sort of 6 primary expressions: happy, angry, surprised, sad, afraid, and disgusted. And these are sort of like, you can mix and match these and like make any other facial expression you can think of. And I sort of took that as like, okay, I want to draw some different expressions. Here's a short list. I'll just go with these. And that can help you figure out like what kind of like, what does their face look like doing different expressions? This is sort of the acting part of it again, is like different characters will emote in slightly different ways. And you have to figure that out before you suddenly need to do it on a page. Something I haven't done as often, although a lot of artists will do this, is to just do a lot of sketches of your character doing stuff before you start drawing your comic. I did that for this project with the funny animals, because I don't draw a lot of funny animals, so I figured I needed some practice. Figuring out like, how do they move around? How do they act? What do they do? And you can see I'm kind of trying to figure out like facial expressions and body language while I'm doing that. Figuring out like what are their outfits, how do they dress. This pug character cares a lot about fashion, so she's got like different outfits for every day, including a shirt that has her own face on it. And the frog character kind of just has the one outfit, but that says different things about those two characters and what their interests are, what kind of their personality is. And so just like drawing your character doing stuff is a good way to sort of figure out who they are. Another thing that I've done for long form comics especially is to do some test pages. So once I've got kind of a script for the story and I kind of know who the characters are, I've got some character sketches. What I did for Phobos and Deimos is I did a couple of like test pages. I took a page from like somewhere in the middle of the story and just turned it into a fully finished comic page, just to sort of figure out like, okay, because when you draw a longer comic, often I'll find that the first few pages, you're still kind of figuring things out. And then if those first few pages where you're figuring stuff out are at the beginning of the book, it's much more noticeable that you've gone through a process. And then by page 6, you've got the characters down and they're kind of the same after that. So I want to avoid that. So I did these like test pages first, and then I didn't end up using them because I changed it. But it helped me to sort of figure things out before I needed to commit to the actual start of the story. So Maida, the character wearing black here, she hasn't changed very much. I had changed her outfit a little bit, but her face hasn't changed very much. I guess I had a stronger sense of who she was before I started. But her friend here, Zainab, is different. So I changed the way she looks because, but I wouldn't have been able to do that without doing these test pages first to sort of figure out like, okay, this is the first time I've drawn her. I don't really understand her very well. And then later on, my understanding of who she is as a person changes. So she's got like distinctive body language now. She's got a more interesting outfit that has like a little more stylish. The background is kind of the same because that's not really an important location for the story, but the characters are certainly different. You'll also notice that it took about twice as many panels to draw this story. And that's only because when I was at this point of the story, I realized, oh, this is a really emotional moment. It needs to feel emotional to the reader. I need to take my time and like stretch it out a bit to give every scene, every action, every comment the weight that it needs. But the main purpose of this was to figure out like, what is this comic going to look like? What are these characters going to look like? Okay, so that's the drawing side. Now I want to talk a little bit about writing because, of course, for making comics, we're doing both. And so some of this will apply to short comics as well, but I think with longer comics, we spend a lot more time with a character. So we get to know them a lot better, and you need to have more of this figured out. Whereas with a shorter comic, you only need to give us like the pieces of the story that matter to that short story. And we don't need to know their whole backstory. We don't need to know everything about them if they only do 3 things. And then if they only do 3 things, then your reader can kind of just like guess at the rest or make it up in their head and just imagine that there's more to this character than they see because they don't actually get to see very much. So obviously when you're writing a character, the main thing, the most important thing is what's their motivation? What do they want? And what they want doesn't necessarily need to be super clear. People are complicated. Like, I don't know what my motivation is from day to day necessarily. And characters don't necessarily either. But if you're writing them, you kind of have to have a sense of like, what's their goal? What are they trying to do in this scene or in their life? It can also change throughout the story. So that's a good way to do character development, is to have what the character wants change. Maybe they start out trying to save a cat and they realize later that this cat is better off on its own. And also what's their voice? Like, what do they sound like? Like, how are you going to write their dialogue so that it's distinctly that character? Do they have unique vocabulary or grammar? Are they very wordy? Is it just like one word answers out of them? What's the content of what they say? Are they shy, outgoing? Does it change depending on the context? So are they one way with one character and a different way in a different situation? These are the kind of things you have to have in your head when you're figuring out what they're actually going to do in your story. Also, how do characters relate with each other? Does a character is a character acting one way with one character, acting a different way with a different character because of how they feel about that character, or because they want something from one character and not the other? Like those connections between characters is kind of where your story comes from. One of the things with writing a story is figuring out what do your characters know and when, like revealing information to figure out what's going on in your world is a big part of storytelling. And so you have to sort of keep in mind as the writer, what does this character know now that they might know more about later? What do they not know? What does one character know that another doesn't? One of the ways you can show this is if they have like an inner monologue, kind of like a narrator voice or like caption boxes. That depends on what your writing style is, whether you want to do that or not. I tend to do that with maybe one character and then not with the others. So I guess that kind of makes it a first person story, but there's a million different ways to do this. So it's up to you. And of course, how does your character change over the course of the story? That's, I think, one of the main things about longer stories is that characters change. They have a character arc. When I was writing Phobos and Deimos, I was like making little notes on my very first outline of like just figuring out what would happen in the story, of like, what is this character like at the beginning of the story? How have they changed by the middle of the story? What are they like at the end of the story? And not just with the main character, but with like all the secondary characters too, because people change over time. They change through the stuff that happens to them. And as a reader, I want to see that. And I think the most important thing of all of this is, how do you convey that to the reader? You can't just say this character is smart. They're the smartest person ever, because that's boring. You got to show us that. Show us them doing something smart, and then let the reader figure it out. As a reader, I want to be given homework. I want the writer to trust me to figure things out. If they lay out all the pieces for me, they show me the evidence of some trait about their character, I want to be the one to piece them together. And as a writer, it's hard to sort of trust your reader with that, to recognize that, no, they can figure it out if you just lay out the pieces, like set up a scene for Sherlock Holmes, and then your reader is Sherlock Holmes. They can put all the pieces together. But that's kind of the fun of storytelling, is being able to sort of be on either end of that experience, of the one laying out the clues or being the one piecing them all together. So you have to like write scenes in your story that serve the function of telling us about the character. Like, give us a scene where these two characters are interacting with each other so we can see that they hate each other. Or give us a scene where a character comes across something that they're terrified of, and that's how we find out about it. That's how we find out that there's a backstory to this and some context. You can't just say, I'm afraid of spiders, because that's boring. I want to see them afraid of spiders. There's a common saying in writing that definitely applies to comics: show, don't tell. So as much as possible, you want to show us the evidence rather than just telling us something. Okay, and here's some different tools for the writing side of things. These are relationship maps. I don't tend to use these myself, but I know a lot of people do. And they're mostly useful if you have like a large cast of characters, to figure out like, how do they all connect with each other? If you've got like your side characters that only meet a couple of times, you might not have a really strong sense ahead of time of like, how is does this character feel about this other character? But it's worth figuring that out. Like, think from that character's point of view, how would they think about this other character? What assumptions would they make? What do they know about this character from the context of things that have happened to them in the story? How is that going to affect their reactions? And then the reader is going to read those reactions, and then they're going to sort of work backwards and understand, oh, this character is fallen madly in love with this other character at first sight because of X and Y that happened earlier, or whatever. But as the writer, you have to kind of know that going in and figure out where do all these characters fit with each other. And I kind of I've seen it sometimes done where people will do this with color coding, but I like this approach better that I've got in my examples here, where it's not color coded, because there's more than one way to hate someone, more than one way to like someone. If you put little text things, then that is a much stronger signpost, I think, for what the meaning of all these connecting arrows is. This is something I have done before, although I'm not sure how useful it is. At least I haven't found it super useful, but it's certainly a lot of fun, is to do a character profile and to figure out I don't know, what's their sign, how tall are they, what's the exact measure of their speed and agility. You see this in a lot of manga just because I think it's fun. I don't know if anyone really necessarily uses it as an essential element to the storytelling, but it can help you figure out a character. If this is the tool that works for you to figure out who this character is and how they fit into the world, then go for it. It also serves kind of as a character sheet. If you've got your full character head to toe, then you've got to start on figuring out what they look like. This is something that I do use a lot. I found these questions on a podcast years and years ago called Paper Wings that was about creating comics. And I really like these questions as a way of figuring out who a character is. And so on the podcast, they had these questions that you see on the left-hand side here. And sort of the one change I made to this is that I decided I don't want to just figure out the answers to these questions. I want to draw the answers, because then I can not only figure out how this character feels about different topics, but also what's their body language, what would they say if you actually talk to them, what's their voice. And so what I have done a couple of times with stories is I did little comics with these questions. So I would basically an interview. I would ask the questions to the character and then draw how they would react if they were asked that question. So the rules I wrote for myself was that the character has to be honest unless they're lying to themselves, which is also possible. They have to answer the question, but they would they answer it the way they would naturally sort of speak and talk. And it can be a good way to sort of figure out what your character's motivations are, and just other random things. Some of these are never going to show up in the actual story. This one part where Maida is talking about her 6th birthday, that never came up in the story. We never hear that story in the comic because it was never relevant to the plot. But it did help me figure out that, I want to have a scene in the story where it is her next birthday, and that this is really important to her. And that does connect to the plot and the stuff that happens around that. So by writing out this scene, I was figuring out birthdays are a big deal because she comes from Mars, and you only get half as many birthdays. So getting your birthday is a big deal. And that is important to her as a character, and then becomes this important plot part or plot point. Okay, so when you're designing characters, you're not just necessarily thinking about the actual character and their outfit, but also the sort of the world they build for themselves around themselves. So what does their bedroom look like? What kind of props do they have that they carry around with them all the time? And I've got a couple of examples here. So this is the first one here is from Princess Jellyfish. The main character here, I forget her name, but she is very sort of closed off from the world. She loves jellyfish, but doesn't care about anything else. And so her room is like covered in these jellyfish drawings she's done. But like you can't see, there are windows, but you don't see them very often. It's a very closed off space. She's like surrounded herself with these images of things she's cared about as a way to sort of block out the rest of the world. And that tells a lot about her character. Like you learn about a lot about her and how she fits into the world by like the things that she puts in her space, her personal space. And then I've got Inuyasha here. There's lots of props that characters have in this story. But one of my favorite props is that the main character has a bicycle. Like she's a time traveler from the 20th century stuck in feudal Japan. And she brings a bicycle with her because it's a great way to get around. You don't, there's no roads you can drive on. But if you've got a bicycle, that's a really useful tool. But it like puts her apart from the other characters in the story, where it's this like very mundane object to us, but to all the other characters around her, it becomes a sort of like mark of how strange she is, that she comes from this place with this weird metal wagon that she rides around. So it tells us a lot about like her, and the way that the other characters react to this object tells us a lot about them as well. So those sort of like props and things you can put in your scenes or in your story can tell us a lot about who your character is. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about the things that make long form comics different from other stories. A lot of those do apply to shorter comics too, but for long form comics, there's some specific things that I think are different. So for long form stories, I think it makes sense to have your plot be at least partially character driven, where if you spent all the time to figure out these characters and you know your readers are going to care about these characters because this is comics and that's probably why what they're here for, letting the characters sort of act as themselves, and the things that they do drives the plot, can like sort of force that connection. It can make characters the important part of the story. And it can be hard to figure out like how to make that happen. It does make writing the plot a little trickier. There was a scene that I wanted to have happen in Phobos and Deimos, where these two characters who previously hated each other go on a trip to Europe with each other. And I had to figure out like, how do I make that happen? Because the way I had written it, there was no logical reason why they would actually willingly spend time with each other. So I had to sort of figure out like, what pieces can I put in the story to make it make sense that they would do this? Because I really wanted to have this scene. So I had to go back into the things I'd written into the story up to this point and figure out, how do I make this work for the characters so that it's a logical progression of who they are? Or if I can't do that, if I can't make it work, then I need to just cut that scene. Because as soon as your characters are acting in a way where your readers are going to say, hey, why would they do that? Then something's gone wrong. Your writing's not working. So another thing you want to have is, I mentioned character arcs. You want to have your character change over time. You don't necessarily need to do that with like the secondary characters, the characters you don't see as often. They can kind of just be stand-ins as like, this character is here to accomplish this goal, and then they can like quietly walk off set, and that's fine. But your main characters are probably going to be different by the end of the story from the beginning, because what happens to people in real life. You don't stay the same. And especially if something dramatic is going on, then that's going to affect who you are as a person. Another thing I think is worth doing is make your characters complicated. Don't make them too simple. Like anytime you're writing a story, you are kind of simplifying the world a little bit. You're drawing a cartoon version of it. But if it at least rings true, if it feels like it could be a real person, then it's going to be a more effective story, I think. So your characters can be messy. They can do things that don't make sense sometimes, because real people do things that don't make sense, but it has to sort of feel like that character. Like, you don't have to have a character who is the perfect detective and never makes a mistake, but they can still be really good at their job and really good at figuring things out. And then they just have like personal hangups and like problems. And one day they just decide, oh, I don't want to go do my detective job today. Like that's what makes them like relatable people. And again, show, don't tell. Like, show us the evidence of who this character is. Put them in situations that will sort of test out what they're like, how they react to different scenarios, rather than just telling us that this is the world's greatest detective. And if you figured out things about your character that you really like, then make sure you find a way to put that in your story. Like, you might need to create a scenario so that the thing that you care about this character, like let's say this character is really good at baking, but it doesn't connect to the plot of your story. It's still worth figuring out a way to sort of have at least one scene somewhere where we can see this character doing some baking and how much they love it, because that makes the character a relatable person. And like, maybe that affects how you understand the character and how they fit into the rest of the story. If you, as the writer, enjoy something about a character, probably the reader will too. So you might want to figure out like, how can I put this in? And connecting to the drawing again, like, make sure you're ready to draw this character like over and over and over again. Give them a really interesting face so that you get to draw their fun face every single time, or like an outfit that's fun to draw, or give them a different outfit every chapter and then you get to draw something new. Like, plan ahead for the fact that you're going to be drawing this character so often, and make sure you don't lose interest in them halfway through. Another thing I recommend for writing is to show your story to someone else, probably before you start drawing it, because then you don't have to go back and make a lot of changes. But get your friends to read your story. If you're working with a publisher, you've got an editor who's going to read your story. If you're writing a character who's quite different from who you are as a person, like, you might need to get a sensitivity reader to look at it and give you their opinion on how realistic this character seems. You don't want your readers to get halfway through your story and then lose interest in a character suddenly because it doesn't ring true. You want your characters to feel like real people. Okay, I've just got one more panel here, and then we're going to do our Q&A. My last piece of advice here is, often you'll hear that writers should kill their darlings, which sounds cruel and unusual, but in this context, I think it means that if something's not working about a character, or if a scene doesn't make sense for how that character would act, then you got to cut it. Sometimes this might mean cutting a whole character. The character I've got in this scene is one who used to be 2 or 3 different people in my story. And then I realized this is a lot of people who don't really stand out as different from each other. They should all just be one character. And then that one character is going to be way more interesting because they have like different aspects to themselves. So I did that, and I wrote out these other characters and just had this one character. And then she ended up being like one of my favorite characters. So she would have been way less interesting if she was just like 3 different people in 3 different scenes that we only see that one time and then never again. All right, so that's wow, that's almost an hour already. So I think we're going to do a Q&A. So if anyone has questions, make sure you type them into the chat. And then Kelly or Kathleen can tell me what your questions are, and I can see if I have a good answer. Oh, and let me turn off the screen share here so you can see our faces, or my face anyways.
All right, it looks like Mufias has a couple. Okay, so Movius says, when doing character sheets, have you ever felt you knew what a character design was, started the reference / character sheet, and then found that it wasn't working? If you have any examples of this, what was it that seemed to be the cause? How did you identify what the issue was, and what did you do to correct it?
Well, for sure. I mean, when you're designing a character, it's a process. It's not like a straight line. I think most often what I've experienced that connects to that is if I have an idea in my head of what I think a character will look like, and then when I start drawing them, they turn out to be quite different. Like that happens a lot. Like the character I showed in the last slide, like the part of who she is was based on a real person that I knew, and so I had in my head that person, that friend of mine, when I was imagining like this character like doing stuff in the story. But then I was trying to figure out like what does this character actually look like as the character in this story, and I don't know, she ended up being like totally different from my original idea, but I think she's more interesting that way. I think the process of figuring out who a character is a process, but you're going to end up with a more interesting version that you actually end up with on paper. Like whatever idea I had in my head is never going to be fully fleshed out until I draw it. And then when I draw it, that's the real thing. Then I can just forget about what I thought this character was going to look like. I don't know. I don't know how well that answers the question.
That's great, John. Let's see if anyone else has any other questions, just drop them in the chat. Mufius, if you want to share more of yours, feel free. Yeah. And anyone else, just go right ahead. Okay, great. We've got a question from Amy Eldridge. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for the great talk. I'm curious to know, when writing, what kind of character descriptions in a comic script are useful for an artist and which are not, or which ones might even hinder the artist? That's a fantastic question.
Yeah. I haven't done a lot of comics as the writer and not the artist. I've done a few. Like I feel like if I were in that situation where I'm doing one job or the other and the character design hasn't happened yet, like the example that I showed for the Riley character, like this was not the first comic that the writer had written with that character. So there was already a character design. Like I didn't have any input into that. It already existed and I'm just drawing my version of her. But if it's a situation where the writer and the artist are figuring that out like for the first time, I don't know. I feel like you can go two different ways, depending on who the writer and artist are. They might want to work different ways. Like an Alan Moore type person I know would have like a chapter on like who exactly this person is and what exactly they need to look like, and the artist had better stick to that script. But that's kind of an extreme. I don't know that most artists would necessarily want to work that way. I think if I were writing a script, I would want to have like as simple a description as possible so that I could focus on like what are the important things to me, the writer, about this character. Like a couple of different phrases, and it could be like any random thing. Like this character is like old and serious, let's say. Like if that's the description, then as an artist, you can kind of take that and say, okay, it's important that they're old, it's important that they're serious, I need to show that on their face. And then as the artist, I can kind of figure out like how am I going to draw that in a way that conveys to the reader those two important things. So that's kind of connects to the show don't tell. Like as the writer, you're doing the telling, and then the artist has to do the showing. So they have to like communicate those words as pictures. And so I think focusing on just like the fewer words, the better, so that the artist can kind of focus on them and figure out their interpretation of like that description. But that's just how I would do it. I mean, as the writer and artist, you want to talk to each other and figure that out because there's a million different ways of collaborating.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's such an interesting question. We've got another one here from Lisa LaRose Art. Lisa asks, do you ever have an issue with wanting to include diversity in your characters, but are worried people will call you out since you don't fall into that group of people?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm always worried about that. It hasn't happened yet, surprisingly. But I mean, I guess I have white masculine privilege that like insulates me from a lot of criticism, where if I didn't have that, I think I might get the criticism a little sooner. I think the main thing is, I mean, obviously, if you're writing a story, you want to depict the world, right? The world around you, whatever the world is, whatever that makes sense for the story that you're telling. You don't want to sort of lie about the world and have like all your characters be exactly the same demographic that you are as the writer. But yeah, I mean, I think being worried is good because then you're going to be careful. You're going to do your best effort to design characters authentically and write them as authentically as possible. There are lots of things that I wouldn't do as an artist or a writer. You kind of have to define your boundaries for yourself of the things that you feel comfortable doing, the things that are sort of within the range of what you can do research on, and exclude the things that are going to be too far outside my experience that I can't do that. Just to pick an example of something that's like not to do with identity, I don't think I would ever write a story about a war. I've written lots of stories that are like where there's a war in the distant background. Sorry, hang on. I got to go fix something. My cat.
Do we have a cat moment?
Cat issue. Sorry.
Okay, stand by, everyone. We've got a cat emergency happening at Jonathon Dalton's place. Some cat definitely was upset that he was giving us all this great information about comics.
I think it's not urgent, so we're okay.
Okay. All right, so you were saying you would never write a story about a war specifically.
Yeah, so because I've never experienced anything like that. So like, I feel like there's a limit, like I can go up to that limit and say, okay, I can write this and this and this that kind of connect to that idea, but there's a line that I've drawn for myself that I don't want to cross because I'm going to be pretty obviously talking about things I don't know what I'm talking about. So I feel like that works with like identity stuff too, where like the Phobos and Deimos, for example, the main character is a Black Muslim girl, and I'm none of those things. But the story isn't about those. It's about other stuff that I have personal experience with. And this is just the character I've put in that story. And that's kind of just a line that I've drawn for myself to say, I don't want to cross this line because I don't know what I'm doing after that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Lisa says that's a really helpful answer. We've got 2 more questions here so far. So just a related one to the one that you just answered. Mufius is asking, do you have any resources for professional sensitivity readers, or sort of what's your technique for finding sensitivity readers?
Well, the sensitivity reader, there were a couple of sensitivity readers that I had hired for Phobos and Deimos. I found them both on Twitter by accident almost. Like the first one, someone had started a thread of like asking for sensitivity readers, and a bunch of people replied, and I went through all the replies and looked for someone who kind of like fit what I needed and contacted that person by email. The other one, I needed someone who could speak Swahili and like was from Swahili culture and so could speak to that. And I could not find someone myself. So I just like posted to the Twitter sphere. I just said, hey, I need this. And then never heard anything back. And then like a year later, somebody must have like been word searching things and contacted me out of the blue and said, hey, do you still need something? And I said, yes, absolutely, I do. Please let me give you money. So, I mean, that's just luck. There are websites you can go to, though. There's don't know if I'm going to be able to remember it offhand, but there's a really good website. I'm just going to see if I can find it really quick while we talk, and then I'll tell you what it is if I find it, that has like professional sensitivity reader services where you can, as a writer, you can go to them and say, do you have someone who can speak to this? And they have like a catalog of people, and they can say, yes, we have so-and-so. Obviously, if you're hiring sensitivity readers, you are paying them because they are doing work for you. Unless you're very good friends with someone who's willing to work for you for free, give people money. And if you can't afford that, I don't know, write something else, I guess. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one that's kind of related. Bunny Mars, I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit of your question, Bunny, because I think the asking about writing from a different culture has kind of been answered from what John said so far. But Bunny Mars is asking, what's your approach to writing characters from a very different time period than your own? Or what happens if a character has a motivation that might be unrelatable to a modern day Western audience?
Yeah, good question. Because I have done like a lot of the examples I showed were science fiction, but I've done a lot of historical or based in history type stories too. I just found the website I was thinking about, so I'm just going to say that here. It's called saltandsagebooks.com, all one word. And this is like, I haven't used their services, but this is the site I was looking at as a possible solution before I just found people on Twitter. So I think I think I know people who have used their services, and it seems legit. I would start there if you don't have another solution. Yeah, so writing historical figures or historical characters. Like, I think the main thing about writing people from history is that people are always people. Like, everything I've read about actual history, it comes across really clear that, oh, people have always been exactly like what they are now. No matter how far back you go, you can find people being relatably dumb and doing relatable things like everywhere, at every time period, in every part of the world. Obviously, that's going to be different because, like, you're living in a different culture, you're living in a different conditions and different circumstances. So that's going to affect who you are and how you behave. But if you start from a position of like, what would I do, or what would someone I know do in that situation, that's a good place to start. Like, worst case scenario, you've misrepresented someone from 1,000 years ago, but you made a really relatable story. I would say read lots of history, especially like from whatever time period or whatever part of the world you want to write about. Read from lots of different writers. Don't just rely on one writer. Especially rely on writers who are actual historians and not history tourists. There's a lot of people who write books about history who are not historians. And like, some of those books are really interesting, but they're not always the best source. And especially like, look at history for people who are not the rich and famous, because you will much more easily see like relatable people in those stories. Like, if you can find stories about like regular, ordinary people from that time period, and it'll be easier to kind of make those connections.
I think that's great advice. A little bit related to that, we have one more question here. Mufius again is asking, when you're writing a character that is not something that you are, but like technically could have been in reality, so like, you know, a rocket scientist or someone who could solve a Rubik's Cube in 3 seconds, you know, something like that. How do you sort out the time you spend learning this skill versus like make it up, hand wave it away? You know, what kind of tools do you use to show this that doesn't feel cheap to the viewer?
Right. I mean, best case scenario, you can get sensitivity readers for that too. If you are writing someone who's a nuclear physicist, see if you can find a nuclear physicist to like give you some advice about like, how does this work? What would happen in this situation? Now, realistically, you can't always do that. You want to have time to actually draw your comic. You can't spend all your time doing research. And it's kind of kind of hard to know when to stop. Like this is with the historical research side of it too. It's hard to know when you've got enough. I think the goal is to sort of suspend disbelief in the reader. And that suspension of disbelief is going to depend a lot on who the reader is. Like I'm an elementary school teacher in my day job, and it's very easy for me to find stories written about elementary school or about teachers where I can say, no, that's not how it is. And it takes me out of the story. Like there's a lot of stories that I'm just not enjoying because I'm like, no, I can fact check that. That's not true. So you always, I mean, any story you write, you're going to run that risk. That's always going to happen. That's inevitable, but you want to minimize that as much as possible. So do enough research that someone, even if they are an expert in that, can just sort of like, you don't need to convince them that you are also a nuclear physicist. You just need to convince them that they can like keep listening to your story, that you didn't just like lose them and they're going to stop listening.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. Yeah, because we've had some great questions tonight. I think that's it for questions. We've got some thank yous. Happy to get the chat saying this was awesome. Thanks for indulging all of my questions, Rufus says. Well, thank you folks for asking such fantastic questions. I think those were really thoughtful and really fun for sure. Jonathon to answer. So I think that's going to be it for tonight. Well, maybe Jonathon, you can tell everyone where to find you if they're not aware already.
In terms of social media, the easiest place to find me is Twitter. I'm Grasshopper Pie on Twitter. My webcomic, Phobos and Deimos, is at phobos-comic.com. And I have other websites that link from there. Also, Phobos and Deimos is on Webtoon. If you prefer to read comics on a phone, go to Webtoon and search Phobos and Deimos.
Yeah, all great stuff. And Phobos and Deimos is going to be published by Cloudscape Comics next year. So you can keep your eye out for that. And as I think most of you know, since you showed up tonight, but maybe you showed up without knowing this, tonight was the first night of our Cloudshops series. This summer, we're going to be having them periodically on Tuesdays. Literally just pulling up the schedule now because I didn't come to this prepared, remembering what the whole schedule was. Every couple of Tuesdays from now until the end of September, we're going to be having these workshops on Tuesday nights. So the next workshop is going to be on June 21st. At 7:30 p.m. and that is going to be applying watercolors to comics with Hannah Myers. And of course, we'll be shouting that out on our social media to remind you. It'll be posted in our Discord, all of that stuff, sort of reminding you leading up if that sounds like something you're interested in. Hannah's a great teacher and she makes her own watercolors. So I think she'll have a lot of really interesting things to teach us about that. So thank you so much, Jonathon, for joining us tonight. It was an absolute pleasure to talk with you and listen to you teach us about creating characters for long form comics. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I think that's it. Lisa's put a link to our Cloudshops series in the Twitch chat, so you can just grab that for yourself if you need it. But that's us for tonight. I think we'll say good night and goodbye, and thank you so much for coming out. Go make comics.
Thank you. Yeah.